Well, thank you, everyone. Welcome to our session on the grand challenges in higher education assessment. My name is Christine Robinson. I am one of the co-directors or co-project directors of this great project. Currently, I serve as the assistant provost for the Office of Institutional Effectiveness and Analytics at UNC Charlotte. I'm reading my name because it's just brand new within the last couple of weeks, so I have to get that down. My colleague, Karen Singer-Freeman, is also a co-director of the project. Karen, could you please introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, happy to be here. My position is also relatively new. I'm the Director of Research in the Center for the Advancement of Teaching at Wake Forest University. And we're really excited to tell you about some of the new developments in this project. We hope some of you may have heard about some of the older developments previously.
And Karen, perhaps it's just me and I'm having issues with sound. Is anyone else having issues with hearing Karen, or is it just me?
No, no, Christine, there's actually quite an echo on Karen's line. I think it's an echo. I don't think it's a bad line, but it is distorting her voice.
Is it better now?
Can you turn your volume up?
Yes.
I don't know. Is this
Yes,
better?
Actually
much
better.
better.
That's much better.
Much better? Okay.
Yes. All right. So we'll go ahead and move to the next slide. I just wanted to make sure you all could hear Karen, because I have the big intro and giving you some foundation, but she really has a good part of the meat of taking us, telling us where our teams are going and what's going to be happening in the next year. And I want you all to be able to hear that. So before I share the mission and vision of the grand challenges in higher assessment, I want to share about the foundation upon which the grand challenges are built. And these are to collaborate on the most pressing problems in our field, to identify practical actions that impact student success for use at the national and local levels, to communicate about our efforts and impacts in a meaningful way to audiences beyond assessment professionals, to enable research efforts and to make significant progress over the next 5 to 10 years, to ensure that our work is transformative and addresses problems that can change the world, not too big. And to ensure our work offers compelling, positive stories that capture the interest of the public. So in that spirit, we crafted this mission statement and vision statement for the grand challenges in higher education assessment. So the mission is to address grand challenges in higher education assessment practices by collaborating with colleagues nationally from different types of institutions through systematic inquiry process, which includes collecting data, documenting critical information, and analyzing and interpreting that data. And we want to disseminate the evidence-informed and practical solutions. Now, the vision is to empower higher education professionals to develop and use assessment practices that support innovation, learning improvement, and equity. Next, I'm going to briefly recap what's been going on with us for the last 3.5 years, I suppose. So in 2018-19, we reviewed recent and published literature at that time and identified 10 challenges. And the characteristics of a grand challenge are extremely hard yet doable, produce positive outcomes affecting many persons. They're associated with clear metrics and goals and capture the popular imagination and garner political support. So what we did was we distributed a survey broadly, newsletters, listservs, emails, and we had about 230 individuals to respond. So in 2020, we narrowed the 10 to 4 challenges: to use assessment findings to increase equity, to use assessment findings to direct immediate pedagogical improvement, to produce visible and actionable assessment findings that drive innovation, and to use assessment findings to improve student learning and institutional effectiveness over time. What Karen and I did was we pitched our idea of forming a grand challenges effort in assessment to thought leaders in multiple higher education organizations. And we have 10 representatives from 10 different organizations that serve on our advisory board. They provide guidance and feedback to planning and implementation teams. They endorse our initiatives and activities and communicate about the initiatives and activities with their members. Karen and I and the advisory board also recruited 100 volunteers to help us develop strategic plans for the 4 challenges in order to guide national, state, and local efforts. Now in 2021, 3 strategic plans were developed and included the identification of national practical actions to impact student success. And what I want to say is the 4 challenges moved into 3. We kind of merged 2 of them together. So we're at 3 challenges right now. We recruited more volunteers because in that first year, some people got a little tapped out with the planning process. So we recruited some more volunteers, some folks rolled off, and now we're still at 100 volunteers that form 6 teams, which are prioritizing and identifying detailed activities for this next year. So in 2022, where we are now, I am proud to share that we have achieved the following. We have developed a new and more user-friendly website. Thank you, Karen, and to our implementation team member and to our team leaders as well. We have a special issue. If you haven't seen that, we'll share that at the end in AALHE's intersection. And that's based upon some of the team members' articles about the grand challenges. And then lastly, we are almost there. The pedagogy team is close to completing an assignment design coaching system. So in the next 3 slides, I'll just give you a brief overview of the organizational structure of the grand challenges in higher education. So as I indicated earlier, Karen and I are the co-project directors. We started this project in 2018, and we are beyond thrilled to see the vision that it has come to fruition, just beyond thrilled. Next, we have the 10 organizations who have representatives serving on the advisory board. And those organizations are the Association for the Assessment of Learning in Higher Education, or AALHE, the IUPUI Assessment Institute, the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment, or NILOA, the Association for Institutional Research, or AIR, the Student Affairs Assessment Leaders, or SAL, the Council for the Advancement of Standards in Higher Education, or CAS, the American Association of Colleges and Universities, or AAC&U, the American College Personnel Association, or ACPA, College Student Educators International, the National Association of Student Personnel Administrators, NASPA, or NASPA, Student Affairs Administration in Higher Education, and finally, the Society for College and University Planning, or SCUP. Lastly, but certainly not least, I also want to recognize our implementation leaders, team leaders for each grand challenge. Thank you to CG, Shannon, Allison, Robert, Daniel, Carly, Joel, Ryan, Amy, Eric, Justin, Meredith, Yao, and Jessica. These team leaders, along with their team members, are volunteers who put in many hours to do research and design useful and meaningful tools that will be adoptable at a national and local level. They represent 2-year and 4-year institutions, private and public institutions, HBCUs, HSIs, PWIs, states in the East, West, North, and South, Kuwait, Italy, Canada, and other education-associated organizations. These co-chairs, along with the 10 endorsing organizations, are supporting the goals of the grand challenges, which are to increase awareness of challenges and identify possible solutions, increase cooperation in the field of assessment, create actionable and meaningful strategic plans at the local and national level, and attract resources to support achievement. My heartfelt thanks to all of the advisory board members and their organizations, and to team leaders and their members for supporting our efforts and taking the journey with us. Next, Karen will update you on the progress our teams have made and the plans we have for the next year.
Thanks so much, Christine. Can everybody hear me now? Great. So the first thing I want to let everybody know is a lot of our language talks about the national scope of the challenge, and definitely this challenge's work has centered in the United States. However, as Christine just mentioned, we do have international participation and we crave more international participation. So I believe in the last session, the speaker talked about how math education is a universal challenge. And I think probably most of you listening can see how the challenges that we're focusing on are challenges, important challenges faced by assessment professionals across the globe. And so if you are listening and you represent an international organization, we welcome more participation as endorsing organizations and members of our advisory board. And we also welcome international participations on each of the teams. I've been told that these slides will be shared with you. And moving forward, I'm going to provide you with lots of routes to different information to get involved nationally and locally. And so each of the underlined words, as you can see here, equity is underlined, will link you to further information. The first challenge that I'll be talking about this morning is the use of assessment findings to increase equity. When we surveyed assessment professionals, this by far was the challenge that received the strongest endorsement. And this working group has the largest participation, reflecting the national concern with the extent to which higher education is currently inequitable and the possible roles that assessment policies and procedures have in perpetuating current inequities, but might have in reducing those inequities. And so if you follow that link, it will actually take you to the strategic plan that was published a year ago. And in the strategic plan, you'll find the objectives and tactics I'm going to speak about now. Now I'm going to be focusing on national efforts, mostly within the United States, but with implications internationally. But each plan also includes local tactics. And this is really important because any one of you can click on the plan and there's a series of steps you can take on an individual campus or within an individual organization to make improvement in these areas. So the first thing is I want to acknowledge the implementation co-chairs for this equity group. Christine already mentioned two of them. Renata and Glenn are also in charge of two of the subgroups of this committee because there are so many people working on this. The plan has three main goals. The first is to promote existing and create new equitable practices for assessment professionals. And there's three objectives that each have the national tactics I'll be talking about as well as local tactics. The first is to identify and share equitable assessment practices. As Christine mentioned, these plans are meant to span a 5 to 10 years of effort. And so the objectives that I have shown in gold are the objectives that teams are currently working on. The ones that are in white are the ones that they haven't yet really taken on. But there was recently a book published, Reframing Assessment to Center on Equity. Christine contributed a chapter, I contributed a chapter, CG contributed a chapter, and many other people who have been working on the equity thread contributed chapters. And this book, I think, is really a huge step forward for our project, but also for the field. And I encourage you all to check it out. That link will take you to a site where you can order it, but also see the different chapters that are included in it. And the idea here is there's a lot of good stuff happening and we need to identify it and get the word out there about it. The second is to benchmark the use and efficacy of these practices. And so this is a stage that will probably begin nationally next year to actually figure out, okay, we know all these assessment practices are best practices from an equity standpoint. How much are they being used? If you look at even the chapters of the book, or if you already are a little familiar with some best practices in equity assessment, there's guidelines for how you could do this within a local organization today. The third is to acknowledge and celebrate equitable practices in assessment nationally and locally. So once we start to move the needle on getting the practices out there, we learn how many of the practices are already being used. We're going to try and create mechanisms to encourage the use of those practices. The second is to provide and create professional development around the practice of equitable assessment. And this team is well at work gathering resources. So far they have 129 resources. They aren't yet available on our website, but they will be soon. Then the next step is going to be really trying to focus in on one particular area of equitable assessment, which is being sure that we include the student voice in assessment. And then the third goal is to engage with existing structures to increase equity. So here in the United States, there's two primary types of groups that we're interested in engaging with. The first is national surveys and databases. So to actually determine where there might be problems with equity in the way these surveys are constructed, and then moving the needle on improving those. Again, this work is focused in the United States, but hopefully the lessons we learn could be applied internationally. And then the second is here in the United States, accrediting agencies have an enormous amount of power on higher education. And so we're interested in trying to increase their attention to equity as a way to move progress within higher education. And so the team is currently conducting a landscape analysis of the regional accrediting organizations to look at the extent to which they are attending to equity and encouraging equity. Our second challenge is three-tiered. So the broad challenge was this idea that we need assessment to drive improvement and innovation. And so we actually have three separate teams working on three separate aspects of this. The first is co-led by Dan Bureau and Joel Farrell. And this is the idea that we need to advance innovative approaches to institutional excellence that center on data. And so one big goal is to increase the integration of planning, data, budgeting, and to improve those, to do that, we need to improve those skills in senior leadership. Then we want to actually increase their use of integrated planning. And then finally, we want to share innovative models of assessment used to guide resource allocation. Here in the United States, a very tough challenge for us is to actually get the money to follow the findings, right? So oftentimes budget decisions are very distinct from assessment findings or evaluation of programs. And so this team actually opted to start with that third objective because they feel like if they can get people to think about resource allocation by identifying good models for integrated resource allocation, then that's going to drive the other pieces of this. And then the final piece of this is to get people to be brave enough to do it. So oftentimes in higher education, there's a real pressure to just prove that what we did worked. And we need to encourage people more to learn from what didn't work and to feel safe talking about what didn't work so that we can improve most effectively. And another piece of that will be creating opportunities to experiment with alternate approaches to teaching, programming, all kinds of things like that. The second thread in our innovation challenge is co-led by Robert Aaron, Carly Platt-Deer, who actually wrote this plan also. She was in the writing team, and Eric Walsh. And they're trying to advance innovative approaches to making institutional findings actionable. So if we want integrated planning, we want people to make decisions using data, we need to make sure that the data we're gathering is good, right? So making assessment actionable is preparing our assessment findings to drive decision making. And so the first thing is we need to improve the quality of planning around data. One piece of this, which is where this team has opted to start, is to improve data collection through the addition of fidelity descriptors, which is essentially a descriptor of how well the intervention was achieved. So this was the plan, what worked, what did you do, and what didn't you do, right? Because oftentimes we know what the plan was, we know what the outcome was, but we don't actually know whether people really followed the plan. And so they presented some conference presentations already, this team, on the use of fidelity descriptors in assessment in various locations. So at the Air Force Academy and at a liberal arts college, I believe was the comparison. And they're currently writing a literature review paper to identify gaps in the research on the use of fidelity descriptors. They also want to improve the interpretation of data by increasing stakeholder engagement. So there's one piece of this is having quality data, but the second piece is when you get your data, making sure that the voices at the table will allow you to think of all the possible qualifications that need to be considered on the meaning of that data and the possible interpretations of that data. Our third innovation thread is co-chaired by Ryan Smith and Amy Svirsky, and they are working to make those good quality assessment findings visible, right? Because that's the third piece of the puzzle. If we want people to use assessment findings for planning, we need to have good findings, and we need to communicate those findings so that university leadership is aware of them. So eventually they're going to be creating and disseminating data visualization and data story resources. Data stories are this idea that we need to create narrative around our data to make it accessible to non-experts. First, they're taking on their second objective, which is increasing the use of data visualizations. And they're doing this by conducting, and I say a national, but we would love it to be international, survey of barriers to the effective use of data visualizations. And when you get these slides, if you click on this link, it'll actually take you to this survey where you can share your ideas about where there's need for resources around data visualizations. And then the third objective will be to increase the use of data storytelling. Our final thread, and I'm wrapping up, not too far off schedule, is using assessment findings to drive rapid improvements in pedagogy. And we have two implementation teams working on this thread. The first is co-chaired by Justin Hoshaw and Jessica Taylor, who were both involved in writing this plan as well. And this is improving the measurement of student learning over time. So I loved the last presentation because adaptive learning is really at the heart of this. In adaptive learning platforms like the math platform we heard about, students' immediate response is used to tailor the educational material that's provided to them in the next moment. And formative assessment is all about this idea that we do something with a student and our feedback from that drives our future educational efforts so that we can best meet the student's needs. A key piece of that rapid turnaround, right, the responsiveness that comes with formative assessment is the appropriate measurement of student learning over time, which also expands beyond that from an assessment perspective. Too often in higher education, we look at a snapshot, right? 80% of our students got this learning outcome, yay. But what we really should be looking at is for that student, are they improving in a particular learning outcome? For that cohort, is the level of mastery or proficiency increasing over time? And so this group is really digging into how are we measuring learning over time and how can we best do it? And they've been very busy. So the first thing they're working on is identifying measurement strategies to evaluate the impact of using assessment to affect pedagogical changes. And a week ago, a special issue of Intersection, a journal at the intersection of learning and assessment, was published with 6 articles relating to this, including one that is a SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats for adaptive learning. So that one might be of particular interest given our previous talk. They also currently have a Spencer grant, which is a private American foundation in review that will support survey development and deployment to gather more information about best practices in this area. Once they've gathered all this information, they're going to be promoting strategies that effectively measure student learning over time through material that will be placed on our website. The second group is co-chaired by Yao Hill and Meredith Garcia. Meredith was one of the original writers of actually a different plan. And they're focusing on the use of assessment, so that good measurement of learning over time, to guide rapid and equitable improvements in learning. And so the first thing that they're very actively engaged with right now is identifying equitable practices that guide rapid improvements in pedagogy. So adaptive learning is one of them. They've actually created an interview protocol, and they're going through the human subjects approval process so that it'll be publishable research to identify best practices being used by faculty. And as soon as that's up and running on our website, there'd be an opportunity for you to sign up to be interviewed if you were interested. They're also working on translating research to teaching practices that guide rapid pedagogical improvements. And so their focus this year has been working with NILOA, an American organization, to use their materials on assignment charrettes, which is where essentially you do role playing of assignments with a group of educators to improve those assignments. And they're using those materials to create a assignment design coaching system, whereby a faculty member will be able to sign up to get a coach that will help them with creating assignments that allow this sort of rapid cycle of improvement. And then their third thread, once they've sort of cracked these two nuts, is going to be to increase the use of these techniques to improve student learning. And so I hope that many of you have questions. I want to conclude by just showing you that in the slide deck that you will be receiving, there are links to many of the publications that have come out of this project. So these first two articles are overviews of the survey that we did, the findings of that survey, and the 10 broad challenges that we identified from a review of the literature. Then we have 3 publications here that have come out of the equity team. The Singer, Freeman, Bastone, and Montenegro publication is actually in that book we told you about, which also has a Heiser article and a Robinson and Hobbs article, or Hobbs and Robinson. So multiple team members have contributed to that book. Then there are a series of 4 articles from a special issue of Intersection that came out last year that are dedicated to the innovation thread. And then all but one of these articles are the special issue that was just released on improving measurement of learning over time. And the last thing I'll leave you with is that when you get this, if you click this link, it will take you to the Grand Challenges in Assessment website. And if you click the second link, you can volunteer to join a team. So there's a form where you can just say you want to be on our mailing list, or you can actually click any teams you'd be interested in joining. And not all teams are accepting members at all times, so I encourage you to select as many as you have. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions, unless we're waiting till the end of the next session for questions.
Yeah, Karen, it's Jeff here. Yes, we'll take Q&As after the next session, if that was it. And I think you both deserve a moment to take a deep breath. This is obviously a very large project, and there's an awful lot of information there to digest and try to get your head around. So we'll give you a few minutes to get your breath, and I'll say thank you ever so much for that. And I'll echo what Elaine's just said. Brilliant, well thought out project indeed. Yes.